Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2316 or Modern World History or World History 2 Online. So, the topic for this week's lecture is the Cold War. This is really the global trend that's going to be dominating the entire second half of the 20th century. And really what I've done is I positioned a few case studies here. My logic is that the textbook does a rather good job explaining the overall gist of what's going on during the Cold War. So what we're looking at as case studies is two instances in which the Cold War actually erupted into open warfare that was going to involve either the United States or the Soviet military, respectively. And then we're also looking at La Guerra Sucia, or the Dirty War in Mexico. And what that's all about is this shows sort of the impact of what the United States and the Soviet Union was doing during this time period when they were trying to meddle in the affairs of other nations. And that's really what the Cold War is all about. We do have these episodes like the Korean War, or like Vietnam, or for the Soviets, Afghanistan, which we'll be looking at today. But really, these are incidences in which the United States or the Soviet Union got involved directly, militarily. But that's not what the bulk of the Cold War was about. It's what we call a proxy war. And that is where the United States went around, or the Soviet Union went around, trying to bolster capitalist or communist governments, respectively. The idea here is that ultimately the Soviet Union and the United States were the two military superpowers of the world. They were also two of the earliest nuclearly capable nations. And so they're really operating on this policy throughout the Cold War is there were incidents in which they almost came into direct conflict with each other. But there's this idea called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And what this is going to do is Soviet fears of the U.S. and U.S. fears of the Soviets are going to make it so that neither side will actually come outright and attack the other. Because the fear is, if the United States attacks the Soviet Union, we would end up having to attack them with nuclear weapons. If we were to use nuclear weapons as a United States, the Soviets are going to respond in kind. And at the end of the day, the whole world is sort of held hostage between these two nuclear-capable nations. And they're trying to spread their ideology around the globe. So what's happening is as nations start to become independent after going through the colonial period, both the United States and Soviet Union are going to try to get those nationalist movements or those decolonizationist movements to sort of approach their sort of civil engagement with either capitalism or communism. So ultimately, if there was, we'll take the Congo as an example, that's becoming independent in the early 1960s. That country there was split between two different factions, where you had a communist nationalist group and a capitalist nationalist group. The United States would be supporting the capitalists, and the Soviets supporting the communists. And it's being done with money, weaponry, aid, things like that. And so this is the process that's going to dominate the Cold War. It's all about using other governments, other regimes, other particular nationalist movements to further the geopolitical aspirations of either the United States or the Soviet Union. So, the first open conflict that we're going to see take place during this period is one that I went into in some detail on our slideshow, and that is the Vietnam War. So what's happening there is it all goes back to when Vietnam was part of what was known as French Indochina, something we encountered during our Asian colonialism phase. French Indochina is made up of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And so ultimately these areas, right after World War II, there's a nationalist movement in Vietnam. And it's being led by an individual named Ho Chi Minh. And he is aligning himself with the communist end of things. And so naturally the United States is at first going to be trying to prop up the French regime there. And when it becomes very clear that the French colonial power isn't interested in trying to maintain this territory, and that's going to be happening around 1954 in the fall of Dien Bien Phu, where the French forces are forced back into a central area, they're ultimately going to have to give up their claim to this territory of French Indochina. And immediately, we're going to see something called the Geneva Accords. And what that does is it splits Vietnam in half. And what happens is Ho Chi Minh and his communist government take over the northern half of Vietnam, whereas the southern half installs a new independent government, but one that is backed by the United States and believes in capitalism. And from that point forward, you can see where there's going to be a conflict in the area of Vietnam. Now, over time, the puppet government that was set up by the United States in the South proves itself to be incapable of running things in a peaceful and effective manner in southern Vietnam. And so ultimately, that is going to embolden the communists in the North to start trying to infiltrate and take over South Vietnam. When that happens, and ultimately when there's an attack on a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, that will draw the U.S. military presence to Southeast Asia, to southern Vietnam, to try to support and reinforce the capitalist government that's operating there. Now, this was a type of warfare that was a lot different from what American troops were used to. And ultimately what's going to happen here is the U.S. is at first going to have a volunteer army fighting in Vietnam, but over time, the type of warfare in which they can't tell the difference between a civilian and a belligerent that they're supposed to be fighting, that is going to frustrate American soldiers. There's the terrain, very jungle, sort of a rich, dense forest, mountainous regions, things that are hard to negotiate. There's a lot of poisonous snakes, spiders, scorpions. This is not the glorious warfare that American volunteers were envisioning when they entered into this war. They were coming from a military tradition that was left by their parents' generation in World War II. And they had this idea where you put on a military uniform, you line up against a combatant or another belligerent, and you fight for a strategic position. But that's not happening in Vietnam. There is no strategic position, and it becomes painfully clear to U.S. soldiers there that a lot of the southern Vietnamese populace doesn't really care about communism or capitalism. So whereas U.S. soldiers are going over and thinking they're fighting for people who want capitalism, they're ultimately just fighting for American geopolitical interests. And they don't find a lot of support amongst the civilians on the ground in South Vietnam. And as time drags on, it becomes painfully clear that the U.S. is not even going to be capable of achieving military objectives there in Vietnam. So by 1973, we start our fighting in earnest when we touch boots on the ground in 1965 in Da Nang. But ultimately, the United States is going to face so much protest at home over this war because the American people see this is not achieving anything. There is no actual military gain here. We're just sort of fighting this ideological battle in which we're trying to stop communism, but the people of Southeast Asia don't really care about communism or capitalism. They want to have safety, security, food on the table, a high standard of living, things that are not unique to either capitalism or communism. And so ultimately what's going to happen is American troops become disillusioned, American generals become disillusioned, and American people become disillusioned. And the fight against the war on the home front, the sort of protests and anti-war movements we're seeing in the United States are going to force American politicians to withdraw without achieving anything in Vietnam. So America loses thousands and thousands of military lives, but at the end of the day, they don't achieve anything in Vietnam. And what this is it's a painful lesson to the United States that we can't keep fighting these proxy wars. We're going to go broke, and we're ultimately going to lose too many people trying to fight the spread of communism. And so ultimately, that is the one incident in the Cold War in which the United States makes a very drastic misstep. And the same thing is going to be happening to the Soviets in Afghanistan. They're going to get involved in 1979. There was already a communist government in place in Afghanistan in 1979, but popular uprisings and a coup attempt there in 79 is going to try to overthrow that communist government. To make sure that doesn't happen, the Soviets give a lot of money, a lot of aid, and then eventually, just like the United States, is going to get dragged in militarily to fighting people who are against the communist regime there in Afghanistan. Now, what's interesting about what we see in Afghanistan is the United States, as they are prone to do in this time period, is going to support whoever is fighting against communism. And in that case, it's a young Saudi Arabian leader who's leading a group of people called the Mujahideen, who are fighting to get rid of the communist government, but also want to establish an Islamic theological sort of theocracy, a state that's based on Islamic religion. And the person who's leading the Mujahideen there, who's getting support from the United States, might surprise you. It's a young man named Osama bin Laden. So the United States is stepping forward and giving bin Laden money, weapons, logistical support, and intelligence on the people that he's fighting against. And ultimately the idea is if we support bin Laden, that's going to hurt the Soviet Union. And that's how the United States is approaching this. Now, surely, as we all can, sort of look back on and use a little hindsight, Osama bin Laden had no interest in spreading the ideals of capitalism or American democracy. What he wanted to do was basically drive out every global power so that he could set up an internal an Islamic sort of state that will operate there in Afghanistan. So ultimately, when the end of the war comes around in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden's going to take that money and weaponry that the United States gave him and turn around and use it against the United States. In particular, in the early 90s, he's going to attack embassies in East Africa, namely in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And then in 1993, he will carry out his first attack on the World Trade Center, sending somebody to park bombs underneath one of the support pillars in the basement or the parking garage of it. And it fails to collapse the building the way he thinks it will. But that's the first attack that he takes on the trade centers. And so ultimately what we're seeing here is a lot like with Vietnam, the idea that the United States ruling group lost so much support from the general populace. The anti-war movement at home was so strong that it forces the United States to reevaluate what it is we're doing and how much we're spending in terms of trying to spread capitalism, detain and sort of wrap up communism so that it can't spread any further or to any new governments. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what you're going to get is that it ends up bankrupting the U.S., in a time when really we couldn't afford to have that happen. In the 1970s, the United States is really going to suffer economically as a result. The same thing happens to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. But what's even more telling about this is what's going to lead to the end of the Cold War. Basically, under the Reagan administration, which is the 1980s in the United States, while the Soviets are fighting in Afghanistan, the United States makes a very public and well-known declaration that we are going to expand our arsenal. We're going to dump tons and tons of money into an expanded defense and weaponry system. And so the Soviets look at that and they say, well, we need to keep up with the United States. And they're spending all of this money in Afghanistan. They start spending millions and millions more trying to keep up with the United States in terms of arming themselves and keeping up in the arms race. That at the end of the day, they're not going to be spending enough money domestically. And the people of the Soviet socialist republics all over Eastern Europe start to break away from the Soviet Union, and that will eventually, from 1989 to 1991, lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is officially the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union collapses and breaks apart and will ultimately become the Russian Federation. So these are these two incidents in which open conflict, open warfare become hallmarks of the Cold War. But the vast majority of what's happening during the Cold War is the Soviet Union using the KGB and the United States using the CIA, both of which are covert intelligence sort of agencies. Those two individual agencies are going to be trying to manipulate other governments and other movements around the globe in order to make sure that communism or capitalism, respectively, spreads to areas where they think it would be strategic, where they can pick up another ally. And the area that we see that happening in the most in terms of what we're concerned with, these non-hot battles or these cold battles of the Cold War, is something called La Guerra Sucia, or the Dirty War in Mexico. And this is just one example of this. Like I said, in the early 1960s, the United States is trying to assassinate a leader named Patrice Lumumba in the Congo because he has communist sympathies. On a number of occasions, the United States had tried to oust Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. It happened in Argentina in 1976, where the United States is meddling in the affairs of that state. In 74 in Chile, they're going to back Augusto Pinochet, who's a general that ultimately is fighting against communist forces that are being led by the democratically elected leader of Chile, a guy named Salvador Allende. So you can see that this is happening again and again and again during the Cold War. But what happens in Mexico is a particularly clear example of that with La Guerra Sucia. So the United States, with the unpopular war that's going on in Vietnam, realizes we need to appease our own people, and they don't want to see us in open warfare anymore. So the decision is made that ultimately they're going to turn to the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, to start trying to achieve these objectives without actually sending in military personnel to different parts of the world. And the areas in which the United States is going to use this tactic most is in Latin America. And then to a lesser degree, they're going to try it in Africa as well, although it meets with less success there. But ultimately, what's going to happen is the CIA is going to start giving financial support and weaponry in terms of trying to support the anti-Soviet and pro-American elements of Mexican society. And so what's going to happen here is that the U.S. is going to just continuously start sending support to a lot of these different groups. But in Mexico, popular uprisings are calling for a leftist government. They're looking, what you have is student groups are agitating to put a communist state in play in Mexico during the 1960s. What they want to see is greater equality in Mexican society. They think there's too much of a difference between the wealthiest people and the people at the lowest end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And they really are going to try and fight against the PRI-ruled government. And that stands for International Revolutionary Party government. That is the government that's being backed by the CIA. It's being backed by the United States. They're getting a lot of money and a lot of support from the U.S. And so, well, the PRI is if you look at it on the surface, it seems like a socialist organization, which leans a little bit closer towards communism. They did really support what you could call rudimentary free markets and free and open democratic elections. So the United States sees the PRI as the political influence within Mexico that they want to support. And there's going to be a lot of violence breaks out between the PRI government and these student protesters. The first one is the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968. And this is where you see a lot of students gathering together in Mexico City, and they're protesting government policies. Now, the government's going to order police and soldiers to attack the protesters. And they're even using snipers to pick people off to try and suppress these protesters. And they're going to end up arresting 1,300 and killing roughly 30 to 45 of these student protesters. And now the death toll is widely disputed, but there's a lot of people who claim as many as 300 Mexican student protesters were killed by their own government. And they're doing this, their own government is doing this with money and weaponry and training that's been given to them by the United States and the CIA. So you can see that the people themselves in Mexico, and this is important because the United States is running around the world saying we believe in democracy and self-determination and people should make decisions for themselves. Meanwhile, they're interfering in the domestic politics in the will of the people, self-determination and democracy, in a place like Mexico. They're trying to interfere with that because it doesn't align with American geopolitical interests. And then there's a second massacre that's going to bring La Guerra Sucia to a head, and that's occurring in 1971, and that's known as the Corpus Christi Massacre. You have the Halcones, who are an elite Mexican revolutionary or military unit. They're trained and financially supported by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. In other words, the CIA is telling this military unit, you've got to get in there, you've got to break up these protests, and you've got to quiet the communist or left-leaning segments of your society and make sure that your government stays in place there. And so they're also going to be reacting to protests in Mexico City. They try and break them up peacefully the first time that they occur. But ultimately, the second time that these protests sort of regroup and come back together, the Halcones are going to open fire on the student protesters with really high-caliber rifles. And they're going to kill about 120 people in this massacre. And this protest that was going on in the streets of Mexico City was in direct response to some of the actions of Luis Echeverria. And Echeverria is the newly elected president there. And ultimately, he announces to the country that he's planning to shift more towards democracy and capitalism and away from socialism. And really what we're seeing here is as soon as he signals this willingness to change, the student protesters come back out and say, that's the exact opposite of what we've been saying we want. But ultimately, Echeverria is seen as reacting to the United States and what the United States wants in the midst of the Cold War at that time. So what we're really seeing is that during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States are going around and meddling in the affairs of a lot of these other nations, and in particular in Latin America and in Africa. You also have a lot of civil wars going on in the former Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, where communist forces are fighting against capitalist forces to take control of the country. And then you also have something we've already introduced, something called the non-aligned movement. There are a number of nations who say we shouldn't be basically held hostage by the United States and the Soviet Union, being forced to pick sides when all we're trying to do is create functional societies in these newly independent countries. So at the end of the day, you have two nuclear powers are basically squaring off ideologically, and they're forcing the rest of the world to sort of go along with this paradigm or this pattern. And ultimately, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States is going to see a big boom in the early 1990s, and the Soviets are going to collapse and have to reform their government into the Russian Federation. So you could say that at the end of the Cold War, the United States is the last man standing, thus they are the victor. But at the end of the day, as you can see, all of the things that the United States did to try and achieve this victory comes at a pretty heavy cost. We incur a brand new enemy that we are still trying to grapple with to the present, and that is finding its expression within Islamic fundamentalism. And early on, we sort of had this adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and at that time is Osama bin Laden. And as we all know, with the, like I said, the benefit of hindsight is we know that ideologically Osama bin Laden was not a friend of the United States. But it shows you that how far both governments are willing to go to try to stop the spread of the other one's ideology. So much so that we begin arming and supporting people who really have no love for the people who are giving them this money and this weaponry. So at the end of the day, this is going to lead to a different sort of world power and a world power structure in which the United States, yes, they're the last man standing, but they also become a very, very big target for a lot of different organizations that are going to start to emerge in the 1990s and 2000s. And that's something we will have a chance to take a look at next week. So that is the overall gist of what I have to say about the Cold War. If you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, feel free to shoot me an email. Take care.